A causal loop, in the context of time travel or retrocausality, is a sequence of events, actions, information, objects, people in which an event is among the causes of another event, which in turn is among the causes of the first mentioned event. Such causally looped events then exist in space-time, but their origin cannot be determined. A hypothetical example of a causality loop is given of a billiard ball striking its past self. The billiard ball moves in a path towards the time machine, and the future self of the billiard ball emerges from the time machine before its past self enters it, giving its past self a glancing blow, altering the past ball's path and causing it to enter the time machine at an angle that would cause its future self to strike its past self the very glancing blow that altered its path. Backwards time travel would allow for causal loops involving events, information, people or objects whose histories form a closed loop, and thus seem to come from nowhere. The notion of objects or information which are self-existing in this way is often viewed as paradoxical, with several authors referring to a causal loop involving information or objects without origin as a bootstrap paradox, 343 an information paradox, or an ontological paradox. The use of bootstrap in this context refers to the expression pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and to Robert A. Heinlein's time travel story by his bootstraps. The term time loop is sometimes used to refer to a causal loop, but although they appear similar, causal loops are unchanging and self-originating, whereas time loops are constantly resetting. An example of a causal loop paradox involving information is given by Everett. Suppose a time traveler copies a mathematical proof from a textbook, then travels back in time to meet the mathematician who first published the proof, at a date prior to publication, and allows the mathematician to simply copy the proof. In this case, the information in the proof has no origin. A similar example is given in the television series Doctor Who of a time traveler who copies Beethoven's music from the future and publishes it in Beethoven's time and Beethoven's name. Everett gives the movie Somewhere in Time as an example involving an object with no origin. An old woman gives a watch to a playwright who later travels back in time and meets the same woman when she was young, and gives her the same watch that she will later give to him. Krasnikoff writes that these bootstrap paradoxes, information or an object looping through time, are the same. The primary apparent paradox is a physical system evolving into a state in a way that is not governed by its laws. Forey does not find this paradoxical, and attributes problems regarding the validity of time travel to other factors in the interpretation of general relativity. 14-16. A 1992 paper by physicists Andrei Losev and Igor Novikov labeled such items without origin as yin, with the singular term jini. 2311 to 2312. This terminology was inspired by the yin of the Quran, which are described as leaving no trace when they disappear. 200-203. Losev and Novikov allowed the term yin to cover both objects and information with reflexive origin. They called the former yin of the first kind, and the latter yin of the second kind. 2315 to 2317, 208. They point out that an object making circular passage through time must be identical whenever it is brought back to the past, otherwise it would create an inconsistency. The second law of thermodynamics seems to require that the object become more disordered over the course of its history. And such objects that are identical and repeating points in their history seem to contradict this. But Losev and Novikov argued that since the second law only requires disorder to increase in closed systems, a jini could interact with its environment in such a way as to regain lost order. 200-203. They emphasize that there is no strict difference between yin of the first and second kind. 2320. Krasnikoff equivocates between yin, self-sufficient loops, and self-existing objects, calling them lions or looping or intruding objects, and asserts that they are no less physical than conventional objects, which, after all, also could appear only from either infinity or a singularity. 8-9. The term predestination paradox is used in the Star Trek franchise to mean a time loop in which a time traveler who has gone into the past causes an event that ultimately causes the original future version of the person to go back into the past. This use of the phrase was created for a sequence in a 1996 episode of Star Trek, Deep Space Nine titled Trials and Tribulations. Although the phrase had been used previously to refer to belief systems such as Calvinism and some forms of Marxism, which encouraged followers to strive to produce certain outcomes, while at the same time teaching that the outcomes were predetermined. Smink and Morgenstern use the term predestination paradox to refer specifically to situations in which a time traveler goes back in time to try to prevent some event in the past, but ends up helping to cause that same event.